is George Adams. If you're not familiar with me, I'm the co-founder of AdoptOpenJDK. I'm the chairman of the Adoptium community. I'm a Java champion and also a senior software engineer at Microsoft. So that's my day job. So content-wise, we're going to do a little bit of terminology, talk about the OpenJDK workflow, talk about the differences between vendors, hopefully find a bit more about what you two are using. We're then going to cover AdoptOpenJDK and its history, the move to the Eclipse Foundation, and then just briefly talk about build and test and the migration path. So terminology, I always like to just put this slide up. So often people come to me and they say, where do I download OpenJDK from? And that's technically not correct. So OpenJDK is the source project, which is the reference implementation of the Java SE standard. It is not a binary per se. If you want to download something, you download an OpenJDK binary, which is something that's been built from such source code. And of course, you then have a provider, which is somebody that builds that and turns it into a binary. So for example, Oracle, Azure, Microsoft. So there's lots of distributions out there. Out of interest, what distributions are you using? Okay, perfect, that's good. So we're going to hopefully persuade you to move to Adoptium from AdoptOpenJDK. And I'll walk you through it. But as I mentioned, there's lots of different vendors here. There's advantages and disadvantages to using each and every one of them. If you're using a particular cloud offering, you may want to use that cloud vendor's build. But I'm here to primarily talk about Temirin because I'm biased. So as you say, AdoptOpenJDK, quick bit of history. So the project was actually founded in 2003, so quite a while back. But its main purpose at that point was enabling people like you and I to contribute to the OpenJDK source code. It was particularly challenging at that point. You had to sign all sorts of agreements, you had to have sponsors. So the idea was that they created an adoption group that would help people get over that first hurdle and get their fixes in. If you go forward a bit to 2016, IBM created a project called GetOpenJDK, which was actually something that I was sort of in charge of at IBM a while back. And a year later, that was donated to the AdoptOpenJDK group, and that's kind of where AdoptOpenJDK as we know it started. You zoom forward another year, and you'll see that we had over 1 million downloads. And so it really grew quite quickly. You go forward another year, 30 million downloads and 23 sponsors. So the project really took off quite quickly. A lot of that was to do with obviously the Oracle license change agreement at the time. A lot of people just wanted a vendor-neutral build of OpenJDK that they could trust. And so it obviously filled a sort of niche pocket in the market quite nicely. We then go forward to 2020, and we had over 200 million downloads. And we were still sort of represented by the London Java community, so just a regular Java user group. And so we felt that this was the time to move to a software foundation. And we went through all the different ones. We looked at the Linux Foundation, we looked at the Apache Foundation, but we felt that Eclipse was probably the best place. They'd obviously dealt with the Jakarta move. They understood how to work with Oracle. They understood all the license changes, etc. So the main purpose of Adopt was to produce business-ready binaries. So what I mean by that is we had a very broad range of platforms, probably the broadest. The binaries were really rigorously tested. We had lots of companies donate all their tests into the project, which was a really nice thing. We had a really clear support policy that was public and available and anybody could read it. And we were backed by some of the largest vendors in the Java community. And actually today, when I check the downloads, we're at more than 390 million downloads, which is quite a scary number, and we're slowly seeing people moving away from that into the Adoptium or downloading the Temirin builds. So the other key point here was that we wanted an open and transparent community. One of the biggest problems we faced was that all the vendors had their source code locked away. Whilst the majority of them shipped it under GPL, you had to request the source code, you couldn't easily raise bugs. It was, there were lots of barriers to go through to actually just understand what changes were in that build. The entire project was in open source, and everything we did was in GitHub and Slack, so it was completely visible. Anybody could see it. And of course, there's challenges that come with running such a large project. We had over 200 machines that were constantly being maintained and patched to actually cope with all of this. And we had over 100 GitHub repositories. So for a project that was just run by the community good, it became quite a challenge to actually maintain all of that and keep it stable and secure. So, as I mentioned, we obviously needed a software foundation of some form. And one of the challenges we had was that we weren't allowed to use the AdoptOpenJDK brand anymore for obvious reasons. The OpenJDK brand is trademarked by Oracle, and so we felt that we had to do a rebrand. And as well, I think the slide speaks to itself. Rebranding is really hard, especially when it's a bunch of engineers trying to come up with names. But we sat down and we worked out and we came up with Adoptium. So Eclipse Adoptium is a working group in the Eclipse Foundation. You can kind of compare it with Jakarta EE. Jakarta is also a working group. And then you have the project inside, which is the J4EE project. We had some really strong founding members, as you can see there. And I'll quickly stick this up on the slide. It's a lot of text. I appreciate you probably don't want to read it. But that was the kind of goal when we set out to put this thing together. And we got a new brand, which was really nice. I think the old AdoptOpenJDK logo was actually created by myself on a plane using PowerPoint. So it kind of stuck far too long. So I was pleased that we actually got a chance to use real designers. And we came up with a whole subset of projects. So as I say, projects sit inside the working group. So we have Temurin, which is the OpenJDK binary distribution. So when most people hear Temurin, that is what AdoptOpenJDK was fundamentally when you download it and use it. But there's other areas as well. We have the Aquavit project, which does some amazing work on testing and doing all of the TCK runs. And then we have Eclipse Mission Control for those that used JMC before. And then we also have some incubation projects that look at things like fast startup patches. So often it's very hard to get incubation ideas into OpenJDK upstream. So what we do is we kind of stage them, run some benchmarks, run some performance analytics. And that often helps lower the hurdle and to get it upstream. And so obviously, as with moving to a new project and renaming, we had a lot of tasks. Even just rebranding, going through all the repositories, changing names in the READMEs. But we really wanted to focus heavily on improving the user experience, improving the ability to contribute to the project. So that was one of the areas that we'd sort of seen from feedback. It was hard to contribute. We wanted to make that easier, so we wanted to lower the hurdle. So pretty much every conference I go to, the first question I get asked is, why Temurin? And there's a really, really simple answer to this. If you bear with me, you might want to buckle in for this. But Temurin is an acronym for runtime, or an anagram, sorry. And again, as I say, this is what happens when you let engineers come up with names. But there's actually an even better reason. So if you look at the chemical composition of Temurin, it's the most similar to the composition of coffee. So we thought it was going to be relevant, obviously, to keep it close to its Java roots. And as part of this, we also created a brand new website, which we launched last month. And the really exciting piece of this is that we created a completely ASCII written documentation hub. So again, one of the pieces of feedback we had when we spoke to users was, it's really hard to find documentation. It's hard to understand the next steps once they've downloaded the builds. So we wanted to make it easier for people to find those next steps. We wanted to make the installation guides easier. And the other thing is we wanted to make it easier to contribute. So all of our documentation is in ASCII doc. You can go to any of the pages. And actually, every page at the bottom has an edit this page button, which is really nice. So the idea is you can just immediately click it, it takes you through to GitHub, and you can make the change, raise a pull request, and get it merged within a matter of minutes. And the other really nice piece here is that we actually list all the contributors. So it's a nice way of saying thank you to the people that help make our documentation better. We're also doing a lot of work with localization, so we're trying to make it translated better for other languages as well. So if we look at the binary and builds section, the one area I briefly wanted to touch on was we have a Jenkins CI that's what builds everything. I must admit, normally it's not all that green, so that's a slightly deceitful picture. But this is how it's meant to look when we're doing well. So the idea here is we have our OpenJDK source code. So as I say, that comes down from the reference implementation project. And we also have a whole set of build scripts, which we keep in GitHub. We push that into the build server, in our case Jenkins. And then that churns out the binaries, and they then get pushed up to the website, the API that we have, all of the installers, things like Homebrew, Docker. And we support a really broad range of platforms, as I mentioned earlier. I think, from when I last checked, it is the broadest range. So we actually support the most platforms out there, and this is quite challenging at times. Trying to get Solaris in a cloud that you can actually build Java on is proving to be harder and harder. So few key points about the sources. All of the builds that we produce are based on OpenJDK. We aren't swapping out VMs. We aren't interested in additional functionality like GC, ZGC. So essentially all we do is mirror those repositories down into our own organization. The only time that we do slightly make exception to that is that we have been known to backport things in advance. So for example, the Alpine backport that went into JEP 17, we started pulling that down earlier so we could provide Alpine builds of 11 and 8 to people. And we're going to do the same with the Mac M1 patches and also the Windows ARM64. So I briefly mentioned Aquavit earlier, and I did want to just cover that. So we provide the test suite, which is called Aquavit. Again, don't ask me why we named it Aquavit. We're really terrible at naming things, but it kind of stuck. And so the idea of Aquavit is it's a completely open source test suite that's available to any vendor to use. You can go to GitHub and download it and run it. A lot of it comes from IBM when they donated AdoptOpenJDK, but it also includes a vast number of application and framework tests. And I think this is where it gets really interesting. I'm going to show you in a minute how that works. But as I mentioned, this can be used to test the compliance of any OpenJDK build. So any vendor can, in principle, use this. So when you look at how our test framework works, we have roughly 58 platforms that we build and support. That's including JREs, JDKs, 32-bit, 64-bit ARM. And then we're building across 6 versions at one point. So in our case at the moment, we're doing 8, 11, 17, 18, TIP, and also we build some other experimental branches. And each one that we run has 250,000 tests. So rather terrifyingly, for every release we do, we run 87 million tests, which is quite a staggering number. Those tests are broken down into a set of suites. So we have OpenJDK, which comes from the JT-Reg ones that are provided upstream. We also have functional and system. External, which is what I mentioned with the application and framework testing, which I'll show you. We run a whole load of performance micro benchmarks. And of course, we run the JCK or TCK as well, which is the technical compatibility kit that Oracle provides us. So that breaks down. You can see the kind of numbers here. So the OpenJDK core tests that most vendors run are actually quite a small subset compared to the 125,000, for example, that we run in external and the 80+ benchmarks that we run on perf. So I promised you I'd show you a little bit about external. So the idea here is that we have a test job, and what it does is it pulls down a Docker image and it checks out the source code on GitHub or Maven or whatever of the application or framework that we're going to test. In this case, we're going to use Derby. And so we check out that source code, install the JDK that we're going to test, and then we actually build it from source and then run all of their tests. And this is a really great way of actually verifying before we ship that our JVM is completely compatible with all of the applications and frameworks that our customers are essentially relying on. And as far as I'm aware, we are unique in doing this. I don't believe that any other vendor directly does this. So to say, it's a really good way of testing stability of builds before we actually publish, which is great. So a little bit on the migration path as well. So we have, most of it is quite simple. So everything that was AdoptOpenJDK, just change it to Adoptium is the general piece of advice I give people. So if you used to go to adoptopenjdk.net, please go to adoptium.net. From there, you'll be able to navigate through and find the Eclipse Temirin binaries quite easily. The blog moved. We also have the API. I don't know if anyone here relies on the API, but that in turn also moved. And actually, if you continue to use the AdoptOpenJDK API, one of the nice things that our engineers did was they made sure it would continue to give you Temirin builds. So often when I actually talk to our customers, they don't realize that they've migrated. It just happened, which is quite nice. Our Twitter channel moved, our Slack channel moved. If you aren't already in our Slack, I'd strongly encourage that you join. because it's just a really great way to collaborate. It's a great way to sort of post questions without filling out a whole GitHub bug. And it's also a great way of tracking things like release status. And then also the YouTube channel changed. So, quick slide on Docker. I hope that's reasonably legible. It's quite small text, I appreciate. So if you were using the AdoptOpenJDK Docker image, all we ask you to do is switch that out to use the Eclipse-Temiran one. We have the same range of platforms, architectures. So 9 times out of 10, the migration path is very simple. It is literally just to find and replace in your Docker file. There are a few situations where we don't have the same distribution that people used to use. And what we suggest there is, I don't know if I can do that, there we go. We suggest that we use the option on the left, which copies. So you can have a different base distro. You can copy it in from, for example, our Debian one, set it up in your Java home, and then it will run the same way as it used to. And then we also have this slightly more complicated example here, which is a multi-stage Docker build. And the idea there is that we're trying to encourage more people to use JLink. So the idea with JLink, if you aren't familiar, is that you can build a bespoke binary distribution yourself that only contains the modules that you need. So we've seen a lot of customers, for example, with Alpine, that want a super lightweight Docker container. They're sick of 250 megabyte JVMs. And actually, they're able to get a JDK that's less than 30 megabytes by just shipping the Java base module, which 9 times out of 10, if you're running something like Alpine that's headless, is enough. You might have to include things like crypto or SSL. For the Mac users in the room, nothing really changed. Again, just instead of doing brew install AdoptOpenJDK, you now do brew install Temiran. And we have the same versions available, 17, 11, 8. And that's one of the areas that we can't automatically migrate people. So I'd strongly encourage you to check, if you are using Homebrew, make sure that you've switched over to that new one. The easiest way is just to completely remove any AdoptOpenJDK cask, and then obviously move over to that Temiran one. I don't know if we have any OpenJ9 users here, but if you are using OpenJ9, we had to unfortunately stop producing it as part of the move to the Eclipse Foundation. But what you can do is go to developer.ibm.com and download the IBM Semaru runtime. It's exactly the same, it's shipped under the same license. There is also a commercial license, I should probably say. But if you just want to get it under GPL, you can do that. So nothing really changed there. So yeah, as I say, the main thing is I want to encourage people to try and get a bit more involved. If you have a particular set of skills, we're always looking for people like website design experts. We're looking for people that can help us with scripting, looking at people that understand, Java at a deep level that can help us untangle some of the compilation errors that we hit. So if you think there's a slot for you that would work, please get involved. And I've got some links here. We've got the Slack channel. That's the full link to get to Slack, and it will actually send you an invite. We also have the Adoptium GitHub org and also the Twitter channel. So by all means, feel free to reach out on Twitter, either there or also at my personal one, which I haven't put on the slide for some reason. It's at @gdams_. So that's all I had. As I say, the main thing I wanted to just reiterate was, please, if you're using AdoptOpenJDK, consider migrating. You won't be using the most up-to-date secure binaries if you're on Adopt. If you have any migration issues, we really want to know. We want to help people. We're more than happy to even sit down at this conference and help people work through that if you have issues that you need to share. But yeah, as I say, that's all I had for today. Hopefully that was clear. Any questions, I guess? I'll take that. Not even you? Excellent. Well, thank you for joining, everyone. I'll be hovering around the Microsoft booth mostly today. And also there is actually an Adoptium booth down at the Eclipse Foundation corner. So also if you want any cool swag, I think we've got some stickers. By all means, go and help yourself. And if you've got any questions, I'm sure they'd be happy to answer. But